Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel on future of work. Sometimes AI can feel very distant and dystopian. And so this panel might help you sort of ground it in reality because work for all of us is very personal. It's something we think about. So with that, we have two interesting speakers who will first give keynote addresses. We can take a few questions in between, and then depending on how much time we have in the end, we can take more questions. So first up, we have Fabian Stefani. He's a departmental research lecturer in AI and work at the Oxford Internet Institute. He's a research affiliate at the Humboldt Institute of Internet and Society in Berlin and a fellow at Bruegel. He's leading the SkillScale project that investigates emergence of new skills and sustainability of novel occupation in times of technological change. A lot of his talk today will build on this. So with that, over to you, Fabian.
Thanks so much, Vaya. And thanks for Cassidy and Will and all of the team for organizing this. Pardon? I think I have one here. It just needs to be turned up a bit, I guess, for organizing this wonderful venue. I'm deeply impressed. And as Vaya already said, at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is a department here at the University of Oxford, we study how the internet and other digital technologies are changing our lives, our political, social, and economic interactions. And increasingly now we got interested in a specific type of technology, which is artificial intelligence. And there I have the privilege of leading a SkillScale project where we look at the role of skills in this development. But before I start talking about this and presenting some of the brand new research findings of our work, I'll have a question to all of you, actually. It's fair to say, if you look at the research of skills, that we all have a so-called superpower skill. That is a skill of which we think it's something that we truly mastered. So sometimes that even might identify us. And I'd like to invite you just for a minute to think about this skill. So a skill where you think like, okay, yeah, I've got this skill, you know, I know how to do this. I'm really good at doing this. This could be any type of skill. I'm not necessarily talking about work-related skills. It could be playing frisbee with your dog, you know. It could be something you do with your kids, with your partner. You could do it alone. You could do it at work as well, something that you learned like 10 years ago, something you learned last week. Think about it. And once you're there, try to go to the moment when you realize that something had shifted, that you realize, oh wow, yeah, I'm really good at this. I got this skill. I know how to do this. You got the skill and you're in the moment. Okay, now I ask you a really awkward question for an economist. How did you feel when you realized this? Yeah, some feelings popping up in your mind. I hope this is not getting too esoteric, but it's still going to be about economics, don't worry. How did you feel? How do you feel? Any volunteers? Any feeling, one word feeling? Empowered. Empowered, wonderful. More? Optimistic about the future. One more? Pride. And one more, there's one more. In a state of flow, wonderful. I've been asking this question at many of these venues, all people, all walks of life, policymakers, researchers. I've been knowing my friends with this question for a long time. They're very similar. These answers are very similar. They feel optimistic. They feel connected. They feel in flow. They feel in touch with the people around them, with what they do. They feel that something had enlarged. You know, they've become larger than life. But mostly they feel empowered. It's a strong feeling of power. And that is something that is about skills, you know. The horizon shifts. We're able to do something of which we thought we might not be able to do that actually a day before. And this is not only true for us as individuals, but this is true for us as a species as well. So I'm not an anthropologist. I have little knowledge of evolutionary biology, for example, but the people who do say that this is probably one of the defining features of our species, that we manage to not only learn very complicated tasks, but also to transmit these complicated tasks, to teach other people how to do these things. For example, to do paintings like this, which are a couple of 10,000 of years old, actually, in the caves of Lascaux in France. But, nonetheless, I'm still an economist. So I'd love to talk about an economic perspective on skills. And I'll introduce one terminology. I promise it's the only economic terminology that I'll introduce, which is the skill premium. And the skill premium stems from the fact that skills, in economics, skills and tasks are closely related. I'm putting this very simply, so for fellow economists and people who are engaged in this, my apologies, it's very simple. But Skills in economics are something that you use to complete a task. And the more precious the task is, so that means the more people want this task to be completed, and the smaller the pool of people who can complete this task, the more precious the task, and hence the more precious the skill becomes, and the premium of this skill increases. This is predominantly, in this research that I'll be presenting, a monetary premium, an economic premium in the sense like, okay, my hourly wage will be increased by what if I present this skill, if I come up to a job interview and say like, hey, I can program in Python. But this could be all other sorts of premium as well. It could also be a premium about like, my child is sick, I'd love to take Friday off. I have the bargaining power to say this if I have a reasonably sized premium on the skills that I have. If I'm the only person able to do a specific task at this company because of advanced programming skills, it's very likely that your boss is going to say like, yeah, I won't negotiate with you. You know, you can pull the plug of our database, so you'll have this day. There are loads of these premiums. There are also premiums about, I heard, optimism. So in the research, we see that people who have in-demand skills, who have these powerful skills, are more optimistic about the future. But, as you might have guessed, the bad news is we're not the only one who's able to complete tasks. Machines can do this too. This is a very particular machine. This is Arkwright's water frame, one of the most revolutionary machines, one could argue, late 1700s. It's essentially a machine that was introduced in the weaving industry. These things in the middle are little threads. And the wheel has been spun by water, and it translates the power from the water to knitting these little threads together to a larger piece of thread that can then be cloth can be produced from this, for example. And once these machines are proficient, technology speaking, proficient enough to do this like a human being, and efficient enough, faster, quicker, more efficiently in monetary terms, the machine will take over. That's what economic history tells us. And not surprisingly, humans do not appreciate that. Throughout history, humans have never appreciated that, actually, the workers' side. For example, like Ned Ludd, who's the name giver for the Luddite movement. Those were protesters, weavers, who went to the barricades, and this was actually outright violent. They destroyed machines because they said, like, these machines will substitute us. We'll come home empty-handed. Our wives, our children, we starve to death. We lose our jobs. Though actually, the contrary was the case. 20 years after the invention of Arkwright's water frame, the British Parliament ran an investigation and said, like, okay, what happened to the weaving industry? The demand for human work, people working with this machine now, grew by more than 4,000%. And why is that? Because the machine made the whole production line so efficient that the prices dropped, and more people saw this piece of cloth on the streets of London and said, like, I want to wear this too. I want to buy this product. And so efficiency gains led to the industry grow, and the people, and that's an important thing, the people that were very closely related to this machine, that were right at the next step of the machine, so whose one task of their entire set of tasks has been taken away by the machine, those profited the most because those were in demand, because those knew how to work with these new machines. But today, we face yet another industrial revolution, and we're facing similar issues, you know, where people say, like, I'm not a robot. They're protesting against the new rise of the machines. And despite, you know, the popularity of these doomsday messages that we all be automated away, for example, colleagues of ours have, like, about 10 years ago predicted that 50% of the labor force is at high risk of automation. Nothing of this has materialized in the sense, like, we don't see mass unemployment, but we do see in the economy that something has shifted. We do see this when we think about increasingly precarious jobs in the gig economy, for example. People delivering packages for large tech companies sometimes just above or maybe below, if you have a closer look, minimum wage. You see that when you look at the Rust Belts in the United States, when you look at parts of Eastern Germany, when you look at towns like Sheffield in the UK that have been massively deindustrialized because of the rise of machines, because something in economics had shifted. And some people say this is the fall of technology. I mean, I'm presenting a very monocausal explanation here. My apologies for that. I hope everybody can actually see this from over there. I fear that people are trying to, like, look through me. It's on there as well. Okay, thanks so much. What we've seen after, what this chart is showing, what we've seen after the Second World War, this is United States data, that productivity and wages have gone in lockstep until one point, and that was the year 1981, which is as I'm trying to convince you, not a coincidence, also the year when the first personal computer by IBM has been introduced in the first offices in the United States. This might be just one part of the picture. Of course, there are many other reasons why this decoupling, what economists call the great decoupling, has happened. The decay of unions, the role of unions in the United States, for example, is one other explanation. But I think economists, in their very simplistic models, where they think about labor and capital and technology producing something, they all agree that these forces of productivity have shifted towards technology, in favor of technology, and less in favor of work. But not all types of work, because there's some projections about the future that were actually pretty accurate. Projections like those guys from Harvard Business Review about 10 years ago, who said, like, the data scientist, I know there are data scientists here, so you can feel really happy about this, is the sexiest job of the entire 21st century. And 10 years down the road, this is pretty accurate. It's still a pretty sexy job. I talked to data scientists yesterday evening, and it's really fascinating. You know, it's not only staggering wages, you know, it's an interesting working environment. They are challenged intellectually every single day. They have a lot of these premia that I talked about, this flexibility, because they are often the people, you know, the data analytics team those departments have become the most powerful departments in some of the companies. And so the bosses do agree when they ask for like a part-time work arrangement, or maybe working for a month from, you know, abroad because of family commitments and something similar. So actually, we had a close look at these numbers, how powerful this job, actually this new occupation has become, because that's what our project is about. We look at emerging occupations and the skills that you need. And actually, the numbers give a similar message as the people that I talked to, as these messages about the sexiest job of the 21st century. We looked at UK data over the last 5 years, labor market data, about 100 million job postings, actually, job vacancies, and we see that the job growth for people working with artificial intelligence, and this could be actually virtually anything, from machine learning engineers to people in marketing working with ChatGPT, has grown 5 times more than the average labor market. We also see staggering wages. We see huge differentials in terms of salary, and we see increasingly high premia. What I mean with premia, I'll tell you what premia are. You know, we measure premia in terms of how valuable individual skills are, and these skills of working with artificial intelligence are actually extremely valuable. But what is even more interesting, this is not about IT nerds. This is not about ICT jobs. If you have a closer look at occupations, it's actually many white-collar jobs where you first think, like, okay, where does AI come into the picture? Marketing specialists are those with the highest premium on AI roles. So we compare people working in the same department, but one of them has, I don't know, done a course in data analytics, is now able to work more efficiently with data. The premium is sizable, around £15,000 in our data set, actually a year for marketing specialists. So, but where do we go from here? I mean, we live in an economy crazy enough that both of these worlds exist, where the sexiest job and maybe some of the most precarious jobs that ever existed, not despite, but because of technology. And so how do we move ahead? Well, one idea how to move ahead also stems from our research, where we had a closer look at, but how is it actually that these people can ask for these tremendous, you know, increases in wage and flexibility? Well, conventionally, there's another factor that influences how these premiums look like. And usually there's an educational premium. You know, we're sitting here in Oxford, and I think, like many people quite rightly believe, that it pays to go and study in places like Oxford. And it does. Conventionally speaking, it does. So there's a so-called educational premium, which tells you that if you have a master's degree, you earn more, and even more with a PhD degree. And actually in our data we find that as well. So there's a steep increase in wages, for example, along the educational trajectory. But the interesting thing is this has entirely vanished for AI roles. There's no more educational premium when we look at these specific AI roles. And one of the reasons for this is because there is no adequately, in terms of formal education, adequately skilled AI talent. Good luck finding somebody with a PhD in machine learning or AI or data science. I mean, we run a social data science master program at the Oxford Internet Institute with amazingly bright students, but only for 4 years. And people say about our institute that we were like the first movers. So it's really unlikely to find people with high levels of formal education. But how do they learn these skills? Well, they learn these skills in new modes. They learn these skills via fragmented learning, via online tutorials, courses, Coders go to Stack Overflow on a daily basis. I mean, I've been doing a bit of coding myself, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Stack Overflow, Fora like this, are very powerful tools of reskilling, actually. So we came up with a couple of ideas. We can't discuss them all. Maybe we have a chance later to talk about this, how to close this gap, actually, how to bridge those who do not have the skills that have apparently become a very valuable resource in our times of technological disruption, how to redistribute some of this power of the skills. But I would like to close with an example that it can be done, actually, 2 examples. One comes from the manufacturing industry, because I've been talking a lot about white-collar jobs, and you might imagine, like, okay, but what about these deindustrialized towns like Sheffield, for example, where people have been doing a lot of manual work? This does work in the manual sector or the manufacturing sector as well. I talked just about a couple of months ago to the head of Volkswagen Reskilling Agency, the in-house reskilling agency, and they had an amazing task, I mean, really challenging one, actually. Just before the arrival of Corona, 2019, in Zwickau, which is one of these heavily deindustrialized towns in Germany's east, they have a huge Volkswagen factory. And at some point, the management had decided, we can't let Elon Musk run away with those electric cars. We need to produce electric cars as well. And this is going to be a factory where we only entirely produce electric cars in 18 months from now. And you're going to change this from diesel, producing Volkswagen diesel, and you move to electric, and you're not going to hire or fire a single individual. And this guy said, like, okay, I could kill myself now. This is too crazy. Or I could give it a try. And fortunately, he gave it a try. And he was really worried about something that people are usually worried when it comes to reskilling, that particularly the older people, those that have been working there for 20, 30 years, might be the ones most challenged by this situation of having to learn really a lot of new skills, because there is a big difference, I learned, between producing like a conventional diesel and a new electric car. But surprisingly, those were the people that didn't experience big challenges, because many of them said to him, we moved from Trabi, which was this dysfunctional GDR car in Germany's east, like 30 years ago, and that worked well. We managed that, so we can do that again. And that's what education scientists call like a positive, reskilling, positive educational event. Like, they had a positive association to learning. They know it works. You can do it outside of formal education, inside the factory. And this is something that we maybe could take away from this example. Another one is Google. I've talked to a guy who works for Google in Brussels, and they also realized this, not surprisingly. I mean, they are at the technological frontier, at the forefront of this development as well. They not only have powerful technology, they also need to have powerful brains. They need to have the people who are able to work with this technology. And what they introduced in their Brussels office is a reskilling policy of 20%. And 20% means 20% of the working time is learning time. They tell them 20% of your time here you can spend on learning. Actually, theoretically speaking, anything, but of course, not surprisingly, many of them go for learning Python and machine learning and other digital skills. The question is, though, what do we do if we're not Volkswagen, if we're not one of the biggest car producers in the world, and we're not a tech company that's producing, billions of dollars by marketing every single day? How do we swing that? How do we do that? How do we reskill? Well, it's not going to go without massive investments from our point of view. That's at least what our research is suggestion. But if I go back to some of our recommendations, I probably won't have the time. I'm already getting signals that I don't, to go through all of them. One is definitely to accredit informal learning. So to accredit this trend that a lot of powerful and valuable skills are being taught, being acquired outside of formal education. And they're being acquired in new formats. The technology is ready, but the institutions might not be ready for doing so. And we need to find ways to accredit these skills and to find ways. For example, a colleague of ours came up with, turning these accreditation, like we have this with languages, like opening TOEFL test centers, where you prove your proficiency in English, for example. You could do these with coding skills as well, where people come in like, I've never learned this in university or school, but I can code. I taught this myself. Let's give me a certification. I'll prove this. And with this certificate, you can go to the labor market. And even with very conservative companies, you could say, like, I have this certificate. It's credible. Maybe it's government backed. And I can show to you, I can prove to you that I have these specific skills. Fortunately, I have to wrap up here, but if you want to know more about this, visit our project page, skillscale.org. We had the chance here in Oxford to do an amazing documentary about our work, but I hope there's still more time to discuss this afterwards and after these presentations. Thank you so much.
I think we can take 2 questions now and then more later.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. I like that you mentioned the. It's on. All right. I'm glad that you also mentioned the precarious jobs in the gig economy. So, what would be your recommendations for that? And not just like workers' rights, but also like upskilling them and making them feel like their contribution to the world is worthwhile and that they're not just being taken advantage of.
Should we take another one or? No, I know. I was just wondering if there's another question. I'm happy to go for that now, but if there is another one, we take those 2 and then I'll answer. I think there's a gentleman in the back.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. I'd be keen for your views on the implications for developing countries, perhaps where the demands on kind of increased demand for hardware that will be powering AI. What are the implications for precarious and informal industries, mining, etc.?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think these 2 questions, that's my interpretation, they're closely related, actually. Unfortunately, I'm bad with timekeeping. I already struggled, to squeeze these bits into this presentation, where I tried to talk about what in our research we call 2 emerging new classes of work, the savvy and the struggling, in the sense that the savvy are those that we actually don't need to worry that much about because they naturally, also by educational inheritance, for example, are very close to digital skills and to learning new skills in general. And the other class is the struggling, those people that had skills, that were working in meaningful industries and have skills that mattered then, but they're increasingly running against the machines, they're increasingly competing with them. There's a third class, which we call the silent, because people, unlike you, which I really appreciate, rarely speak about. And those are the people that we actually need a lot for technologies, let's be frank, like ChatGPT to function the way that we want it to function. These are click workers. These are people that are annotating text or images via platforms. I'm not shaming any platform here. Platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk, for example, but there are many, many other smaller platforms. And these are often, by the logics of economic globalization, of arbitrage, outsourced to places where labor costs and also labor standards are low or sometimes non-existent, the Philippines, Bangladesh, India, Kenya, Ghana. And these are thousands, tens of thousands of workers that are working every single day and sometimes, unfortunately, under very precarious conditions. I learned, though, sometimes not under so precarious conditions, so in relative terms, relatively good conditions. But we need these people, and there are obvious problematic situations right now, and I think the 2 are connected because right now, this is increasingly outsourced through the so-called global south to developing countries or economically less developed countries. But it's also something that's already appearing in Western countries. So increasingly, people in the Rust Belt in the United States are doing this as well because their precarious on-site job is not enough to pay the rent entirely. So they go to a second or third job online where they do this type of click working. What's the positive spin to this that you could give to this? I mean, to this, you can't really give a positive spin, but the thing is, we've been looking at these online labor markets, this type of platform work, and it is potentially also a success story for some. Because if you think about it, the reason why it's outsourced to these places is because it's a truly global market. This type of work, this can be fully digitally delivered, so it can be fully transferred around the world. But there's also other type of work that can. And the advantage of this global market is it's facing a global demand. So it's also facing customers from Switzerland, for example, that are willing to pay a lot, actually, for advanced services like software development or advanced graphic design or advanced translation work to be paid. And we do see workers also from global south countries that engage in this type of work and actually make a very decent living on these platforms. This is the exception. I'm not saying that these platforms are doing a great job, but what I'm trying to say is that it is possible. So if you help these communities to build the human capital, it's possible for them to engage in a relatively prosperous type of work on these platforms. But it's not going to happen, by just distributing internet. So the infrastructure is a necessary condition, but you need to help building human capital on the ground. But the platforms could play a role in this, actually. So we've been advocating for the platforms to reduce their function as a gatekeeper, because often it's difficult for people to get a job on these platforms. And this is because of the platform architecture. It's because the platform sometimes doesn't really care, because there's so many people wanting to buy this, they don't care about the worker side. There's a huge pool of workers that could complete this, so they don't care about the workers, for example, that have never made an entry to the platform, that never gained a reputation. But this initial reputation, for example, is very important. So this is one of the pieces where the platforms should also be held accountable for these working conditions and help improving these working conditions when it comes to this third type of click work that we all need for the technology that we have in our pockets needs this type of work to function. So it's a very important part of the supply chain, actually.
Thank you, Fabian. Our next speaker is Roy Bhatt. He's the head of Bloomberg Beta, an early-stage venture firm backed by Bloomberg that invests in North American startups making work better. He also chairs the Aspen Business Roundtable on Organized Labor. He was the commissioner for California Governor's Future of Work Commission. He was named the Fast Company's most creative person in business. And in addition to his work with established corporations and day zero startups, he served in the government and led a not-profit. Roy, it's really exciting, and I'm actually curious about what it means to be creative today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I think I've got a mic now. While this comes up, I'm really encouraged to see this group here because I feel like we've got a group that represents a very wide range of perspectives. So I'd just like to see how many of you consider yourself, while I take a picture of the audience, which I like to do when I speak, more important than the speaker, how many of you consider yourselves builders of AI? Okay. How many of you consider yourselves users of AI? Who's used ChatGPT or Claude in the last 24 hours? Okay. Well, so what I'm going to do today is offer one framework for how to think about the effect of different kinds of AI as users, and to some extent as builders, on work. So I'm Roy Bhatt. I started Bloomberg's VC firm, which is called Bloomberg Beta. We began 10 years ago. And the only thing we've done since we started is invest in the future of work. Of course, today, AI is at the heart of that. And we can see our entire society, government, all of our institutions, labor unions, cultural institutions, trying to parse what does this very strange moment mean. And what sometimes gets lost in that is the responsibility of the companies and organizations that are building and implementing AI for what shape this all takes. AI is not a force of nature, it's a force of humanity. And so I'll just give us a framework for how to think about it. So our firm was actually the first to invest in AI, or to focus on investing in it anyway, since 2014. Over my objection at the time, I thought it was way too early. I turned out to be catastrophically wrong. And in those 10 years, what we've seen is the arc of the evolution of a technology, and it rhymes with some things we've seen in history. So of course, industrial automation in factories posed many of the same questions that AI does today, many of the same worries about replacement of jobs, many of the same worries about the shifting structure of the society. That said, that technology was different from AI today in many ways, but one particularly profound way, which is this is a thing that people saw at work. This was not a thing that you brought home. It wasn't a thing that your high school-aged child would tell you about how to use better than you could. Because when people use technology in their daily lives, it produces something quite different, which is that it often produces panic. And so this is one of my favorite examples. These are New York City police officers being called by the then mayor of New York to smash pinball machines because pinball machines were going to be completely destructive to the fabric of society. They were encouraging gambling, encouraging bad behavior by youth. And today we look at it and we just think this is kind of ridiculous and absurd. And so AI now really is special, not unique, but special, because it unites these two elements, this economic effect that flows through the workforce and this panic effect that flows through all of our daily use of the technology. Now, we have seen that before. In the late 90s, we saw it in the use of the internet. And so you saw many people groping for how should we understand? I mean, a book about how to use an internet service just seems kind of wacky. But then today, we see exactly the same thing. And yes, there is ChatGPT for dummies, whatever it may be in there. And what I think this reflects is the fact that AI feels incredibly confusing right now. For those of us who are investing in it, for many people who are building it, even for people using it, it feels alien in ways that shock some of our intuitions. You know, on some level, it's much more confusing. I'm old enough to remember the introduction of the internet as a widespread consumer technology, and this feels different. It feels more confusing. Everything, everywhere happening all at once with AI. And if your head is spinning, you're not alone. This conference is an example of how rapidly the thinking is developing. Anton is a founder who we backed, who a week ago said on any given weekend in San Francisco, hundreds of people will show up to hack on AI applications for 24 hours straight. Of course, there's hacking happening here as well. And so the pace is just rapid. And I feel like we're in this moment where it's not quite too late, but very soon it will be. And the surprising thing in the late 90s, if you think about what happened with the internet, was there were pronouncements that, oh, none of these startups will work. They'll all fail. They're made of, spit and chewing gum. And then people saying, well, none of these big companies will ever figure out the internet. They're dinosaurs. They're behemoths. And of course, both were right and both were wrong. Because the organizations that experimented rapidly and figured out how to take advantage of the internet actually are thriving today. And some of those are startups, some of those are big companies. And so how do you prepare yourself? Well, Fabian's talked about AI as a professional skill, the AI roles. It's also true that AI, like writing, is a widespread skill that everybody can use. And so the mere use of AI in any role is something that people can get better at. They can develop intuition about what may work and what might not work. They can discover uses that are unexpected. When spreadsheets were first introduced, everybody thought this is for financial modeling. And nobody really thought until lots and lots of people had tried VisiCalc and Lotus 1-2-3 and Excel for a long time that this is actually really good for making lists. It's really good for project plans. It's really good for seating charts at weddings. And we're in that kind of same phase with AI where as a society, we don't quite yet know exactly what it's going to be used for. And so therefore, everybody needs to get in on it. We backed a company called Charter that does research that showed that older workers are significantly less likely to be using AI. Women are significantly less likely to be using AI, not in this room. And everybody just needs to get in on the action, because what will happen is that we'll develop our intuitions. And so some things are relatively straightforward, something that looks easy and is easy. People throughout an organization using ChatGPT or Claude. And by the way, there are many large organizations thinking about hiring some fancy consultant to assist them in this. For the price of, I used to work at McKinsey, for the price of one McKinsey consultant, which you can't buy one McKinsey consultant at a time, they force you to buy a whole team, you could have, I think the number was something like 1,000 employees on the paid version of ChatGPT. Which one is more likely to produce an insight for an organization? Some things look hard and are in fact hard, so if you wanted to create your own model from scratch, Bloomberg, as a research project, built Bloomberg GPT, which queries the world's largest store of financial data. That's very difficult to do, and it looks difficult to do. The magic, in some ways, lives in the surprises in our intuition. So part of it is where the current opportunity of things that look hard but in fact are easy are magical initial uses of something where a demonstration, you just go, wow, that didn't occur to me. For example, I took a CSV, just a simple file of my LinkedIn contacts, uploaded it to Claude, and said, who are the people I know who are heads of sales at large companies with significant hourly workforces in retail? That is not a thing you can type into LinkedIn search. And I got back answers that were 50% gold and 50% garbage. And then I fed back the 50% that were gold, said more like this, less like that, and then I got better answers. That's an example of the kind of thing that you would think would be very difficult. That was just a simple matter of the right keystrokes. Now, what turns out to still be very hard is that last mile that makes the use of AI actually good for customers, in the sense that it has to be at a much higher standard than something that might just work in the office. And the only way we can figure that out is by using it. And so a framework that I'd like to introduce for people to think about the different ways that these AIs show up. So I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of AI applications. I'm going to build on the previous presentation. A loom, a slide rule, and I continue to date myself, and a crane, and I'll explain the difference. A loom, I think we all know, is a piece of technology which, while it may initially assist the user, ultimately can replace the user of that technology. A slide rule is built for speeding up or making more accurate the person who uses it. Some people in the AI world call a slide rule, some people in the AI world call the slide rule a co-pilot. There are different metaphors for it. And the economists often enter into these debates over replacing technologies versus augmenting technologies. And I believe there's a kind of augmenting technology that is profoundly different from the others, and that's a crane. What's special about a crane as a piece of technology? Well, a human being, given infinite amount of time, cannot, on their own, in the absence of support from a piece of technology, lift a heavy steel rivet 5 stories into the air. And so kinds of artificial intelligence that allow us to do things that we would not be able to do but for the existence of that technology have some profound effects. Translating from one language into another, indexing millions of web pages and predicting which one you're going to be most likely to click on, discovering new molecules that could be useful as medicines, helping you write an unbiased performance review. Not something you can sit there and do on your own. You need the data in order to be able to do it. Textio is a company in our portfolio that does just that. My personal favorite, which I saw in the Daily Mail a week or 2 ago, is a technology that allows you to predict which large, ferocious animals will win battles with each other. And so a hippo will beat a great white shark. And so those are 3 kinds of applications with really different implications. You have a loom that ultimately intends to automate a person's work. You have a slide rule that makes a person better. And you have a crane that fundamentally extends the capacities of what a person can do. And so why is this important? Because the more we extend the capacities of what people can do, the more valuable they become. Their marginal productivity of their labor becomes higher. Under the right conditions, they can have more leverage in the job market. They can get paid more, et cetera. And so it turns out, though, that cranes are actually very difficult to imagine. One of the reasons and looms and slide rules, by the way, of course, are also very valuable. They're easier to imagine because it just says, take this thing this person does, and in a relatively anthropocentric way, replace it. Just have a machine do the thing that it does. Cranes, you have to sit and think, well, what am I actually trying to do here, and what alternatives might exist to the way I've been doing it? So I'll give you another example where it takes time to discover the extension. Early television ads were actually just radio ads where the presenter sat there and read the ad. It took a long time before people realized that, oh no, maybe the advertisement on television should be more like its own show, more like a mini movie. And so it takes time to figure that out, and I think that's the race that we're on now. And so it's not just that using AI is a skill, it's that imagining how to use AI is a skill. And startups at the moment are fast at work at that. We're proud to back many of them. Many of them will do very well. Already in the time since we've existed, we've backed 79 individuals who have become millionaires on the startup they've started, another 22, I think it might actually now be up to 24, that have made $10 million or more. And, and I think there's going to be more of them. And then while the startups are hacking away, The large organizations will also decide how to implement this in their strategy. And so I'll just close with a few observations on what seems to be working for larger organizations. I tend to think about companies, but I think many of the same ideas will apply to nonprofit organizations, NGOs, maybe even to university research. I don't know, you all tell me. So it depends really on what the goal is of the organization. So some organizations, really their goal, though most will be reluctant to say it out loud, is they just want their employees to feel like they're modern, right? I mean, they just want them to not be using old tools. In that case, very simple answer, just buy the tools for everybody and let them use it. It'll have lots of benefits anyway. There's a second kind of thing that I see a lot, which is just to placate the investors in the company who say, what is your AI strategy? Or in a nonprofit sometimes, the funders, the foundations, the philanthropic foundations, the fund might say, what is your AI strategy? There's a very simple answer there too, which is just take something you were already doing, add the letter A and the letter I to the end of it. And the truth is, a dirty secret among many of us who work on the business applications of AI is that most of what passes as AI in the work is, for the more statistical among you, logistic or linear regression. And that's it. We've been doing it forever. It's just like draw a line through some dots. I mean, more mathematically complicated than that, but you can relabel it as AI. Of course, the most difficult part is to deliver something that is actually valuable. And so how might somebody think about that? Well, there are a few mistakes to avoid. One is assume that because OpenAI did it and Anthropic did it, I can do it too. Facebook has an open source model. Another is to ignore the considerations about the underlying quality of the data that you have, the safety of how it's stored. Many organizations are waiting. They think that if they can only come up with the right strategy, they might just know. This is, despite this being a PowerPoint, this is not a PowerPoint exercise. Many organizations are also blocking the use of generative AI for any purpose. Of course, some limitations are appropriate. Organizations need to have some control over customer data, over their own proprietary data, but the ones that say halt are probably going to be left in the dust. Many of them think AI is magic. It is not. Or they want to replace systems wholesale with an AI system, and there's really no need to do that. AI often works in concert with many of the other systems at play. Last thing is that there is now a whole universe of people who will sell you some service about how to introduce AI into your organization, and most of them should be avoided. We can talk about, if you're interested, how to find the ones that shouldn't. So instead, what should organizations do? Of course, they should encourage people to experiment, because that's the only way they get better at it. And imagine. Start with something fast, really fast. See how it works. Make sure the data are clean, normalized. I mean, this is just the same as if data scientist is the sexiest job, I don't know, the formatter of the data that comes before that, maybe, I don't know, somebody's going to come up with the analogy for that. Most organizations don't even really know what their people do. That seems like a step in the right direction. If you want to imagine better ways of doing things, it really helps if you inventory that work. Some team should probably have responsibility for tracking this and learning and sharing those learnings throughout the organization, not controlling it. There are many standards available for how to use AI responsibly, and of course, to integrate it with the systems that are already in place. Last, as I said, some vendors are selling something real and some are not. There are some ways to tell them apart, which we can talk about. And ultimately, what happens if you put that together is you end up realizing that it isn't witchcraft. You can start using these things now. You can develop an intuition about whether a particular form of AI will work for your organization, whether it'll be easy or hard. You can introduce the looms and the slide rules because they're really valuable. And you can start to imagine the cranes, because I think the companies and organizations that do that will be the ones that end up thriving. And of course, the benefit of the cranes is also that they tend to be really good for workers. And so they allow companies, organizations to pay workers more, and that makes a better society for all of us. And ultimately, I think those solutions tend to produce a lot less panic. You notice the self-driving car, people are really bugged out about, but I never heard somebody say, I'm really terrified that AI may come up with new molecules to cure a disease, because that's a thing that's painstaking to do as a human being. And I've never heard somebody say, this is awful. I mean, actually, that's not true. There are always people who will say it. I have yet to find a reasonable person who says it's awful that AI will translate from one language into another. And so cranes ultimately allow the construction of something that is profound. And so that's how we think about this moment. People should start now, develop intuition, imagine some cranes, And we're easy to find on the internet. And so if you're thinking about how to do that, the dialogue can continue. Thank you.
Hi, so maybe we can start with questions for Roy, and then we can open it up for both.
And can I make a request? Can people ask a question, introduce yourselves so we know kind of what perspective it's coming from?
Yes, hi, I'm Grant Blank. I'm at the OII. I guess I agree with much of what you said, although I think the technology is much more accessible than I think you said it is. Almost any one of our graduate students could put together a large language, well, a small language model in an evening, just downloading the Python packages. But I think the one thing that I wanted to ask you about is, I think the difficulty here that you didn't point to is figuring out something that'll deliver business value. I mean, the translation example you used, I agree, it's an extremely valuable thing, but there's no moat around it and it's free, basically, to everyone. So nobody's going to make any money off that. So you have to not only find out the hard part is, figuring out what's actually going to be profitable out of all these possibilities. I mean, everyone right now is sticking AI onto every dialog box on the internet. And so, you're going to see that everywhere. There's no benefit to that to any particular company, except perhaps the part about making your employees think you're modern, as you said. So can you speak a little bit more about how do you, as a venture capitalist, determine what's going to add business value?
Sure. So first, on the point about models being easy, I think it, of course, depends on how big and how useful a model. I mean, I can make a 3-variable linear regression that might be useful for some purpose, and that may be straightforward. So here I'm really referring to general purpose generative AI models that have some more specific use than what's available out of the box with, pick your model, Llama, or one of the ones you can access through an API. The answer to your question about how to make sure that the introduction of these technologies, how to assess whether the introduction of these technologies will be sustainably profitable for a company, I think it's a really boring answer. I don't see any reason why it's different in the age of AI compared to any other age that came before it, which is to say, is there some proprietary either mechanism or data source or something that a company can access? Now, what tends to happen in AI introductions is that you can find an increasing return to scale that's very defensible through some kind of loop between usage, quality of data, quality of model, and usage. I mean, on some level, that's why Google is so valuable. Lots more people use Google. Google has better data on which link you're likely to click on. Therefore, more people use Google, and it continues. But there's nothing, I don't think there's anything different in the physics of it compared to any other technology, or at least I can't think of anything.
Hi, Cameron Booker from the Smith Institute.
Sorry, can you say that again? From the
Smith Institute.
Thank you.
You alluded to it a few times, and I just wanted to push you on how to sniff out the snake oil salespeople and where.
I'm sorry, the acoustics in here, I can't quite hear.
Yeah, it's probably because I'm the other side. How to sniff out the snake oil salesman in the AI world.
Sorry, can you?
Sniff out the snake oil.
Oh, how to find the snake oil salesman. Okay.
And so, this is coming from the perspective of someone who you might class as a snake oil salesman.
Well, I mean, fair enough. I mean, look, I sell money for a living, so it's far beyond me to criticize. One question is how close that consultant or advisor is to research that's actually been happening. And so the people who are good at knowing what's possible as professionals, call it an AI role of implementation, tend to be pretty close to research. They tend to know what frameworks you can use. They tend to be connected on LinkedIn with people who work at the AI labs. I mean, that's another example. And then, so that's one kind of test. The second test I use is, if you took away all the AI language of what they do, does what they do seem to be fundamentally different from what a software development consultant or pick the task that they're in would have been the day before? And I kind of applied the same test to crypto snake oil, is if you took away all the crypto words, did the thing actually seem like something different and important to what was there before? And if it doesn't, then chances are they just did the thing that I said you can do to placate investors, only they're placating their customers, which is they were running a website development company, and then all of a sudden they became a generative AI website development company. And so those two signals of closeness to research and about how much change in the activity AI actually meant, to me, tend to be two pretty good bellwethers. And then you have all the regular stuff, which is develop a network of people you can ask, who you trust, and triangulate among them, and ...
So I think we can now take questions for both, and I'll start with the first one. With future of work, often there are extremes. Today we heard a fairly positive, optimistic note about how things can get better. But if you're in a different room, you can also hear a very gloomy, doomy scenario of what AI might lead to. So my question is, how do you sort of reconcile the two extremes, right? Because from what I've seen, they often operate in their own silos. But the reality is we have to work together in both. So what are ways that you can maybe make the optimist and the pessimist with regard to future of work come together to do something tangible? Because a lot of what will happen tomorrow will need to start with something today, right?
Thanks. I think venues like this are a good start, because in the venues I sat in myself as somebody listening to the smart things people said, I actually heard both of these perspectives. So this morning, when it came to AI in journalism, the panel and the room were more or less split 50-50 when it comes to whether this is like a very promising future or a rather pessimistic one. But I think the big challenge is actually not to be distracted by doomsday scenarios, because there is a real threat out there. So in my domain where I'm researching, it's inequality, I would say. And it's not mass unemployment, but it's staggering inequality that's perpetuated by this technology. For example, just advocating for the course again when it comes to the distribution of skills and the capacity of learning new skills. This is something that we all know. So whoever studied, socioeconomic, educational cleavages in societies like the UK, like the United States, like Germany, comes to the conclusion that already existed before digital technologies, that the chances of learning something new, acquiring new skills, moving on in life because of education are much higher for people, for kids who come from an affluent background, who come from a family of academics, for example, than from a working class family. And this has already been a challenge and under-addressed, and it's only going to be accentuated by digital technology in a positive way, potentially, for those who have the means, because then they have now also they're augmented in learning, they have the technology on their side, but unfortunately also in a negative way for those who do not know how to not only navigate with this technology, but also might be using this technology in a potentially harmful way of, developing addictions when it comes to gaming or mindless gambling or consumption of fake news without being aware what this actually means, if this can be trusted. So stop talking about the mass unemployment and talk about the real problem problems of which educational inequality is one of them, but of course there are many others.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just offer that, if the question is how to reconcile the rosy future with the doomsday future, I wonder why we need to reconcile them at all. I mean, it seems to me that every major wave of introduction of a technology has caused both. And, economists love to look at total employment numbers. From the perspective of any individual, that really only matters if you're an economist. After the Industrial Revolution, we had plenty of war. And so the question to me is, how do we create scenarios where we can accelerate the progress of technology without causing the suffering that may, left to its own devices, those introductions of technology cause? And it's a real reason I'm a believer in a much higher social floor, is because I think that if we have the institutions in place that allow everybody to share in the prosperity of the technology, not only is that a more just outcome, but it's also an outcome that allows you to go faster. Because you won't have the same sources of opposition if people are not afraid of what it might mean for them.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Is it on? Yes, it's on. Hello, my name is Maxwell Stern. I'm a student in the U.S. And I wanted to maybe explore more what this last question was touching on. What is the role of public policy in the government in incentivizing augmentation instead of automation?
Plenty of role. I mean, I don't know the tax law in the UK or the accounting law in the UK, but in the US, accounting and tax heavily favor the kind of anti-labor practices of companies. You can amortize a machine, you cannot amortize a person that you've hired. So that's just one example that lives in the background. You know, the social floor is obviously a case of public policy, and the truth is, government is the first venture capitalist. The only reason we have all this technology is because of partially, if not fully, government-funded academic research. And so, and the UK was obviously active in that much more consistently than the US was, and Canada was even more consistent. You know, it's my read of the history, others may see it otherwise. And so to the extent the research incentivizes the creation of technologies that are not about being built in the image of the creator, but instead extending our capacities, we may end up with more of them. So those are just a few examples.
Thanks. Yeah, I very much agree. When it comes to eradicating these inequalities, I'd love to say, you know, there's a magic trick and technology is going to help us and it's going to be all cost efficient and stuff like that. I think it's not. We need the biggest, arguably, venture capitalists, which are governments. I know this is a potentially politically tainted opinion as well, but I mean, we've seen this in so many sectors. So I think it's rather foolish to believe that development of robotics would be at the stage where it is right now without DARPA, which is a government-funded playground, you know, where people could, in a decentralized way, you know, experiment with a lot of ideas and then to have it centralized by the government and scale it up with a lot of money. And for me, it's still hard to see that, particularly in economies where there are, you know, also because of environmental changes, increasingly human capital has always been an important resource, but it's becoming more and more and more important for the advancement of society in terms of innovation, in terms of progress, how little attention is being paid to investing more in this, investing more in human capital, but not for privileged few, but for the entire society, actually.
We can take one final question.
Make it really good.
Okay, in that case, I will take the final question.
Okay, I'm taking a picture of these guys up here. This is so fun.
This one has to do with failure. So with AI, something I saw in both of your presentations was the idea of experimentation, the idea of trying. And while it's great to try and experiment, the probability of failure is also fairly high. And as humans, most of us rationally are a little risk averse, right? And historically, at least, when you failed and tried, there were different social and economic and cultural safety nets that caught you when things didn't work out. You knew when to pull the plug. Not always, but most of the times, because it were more sort of institutional structures that ensured you were experimenting, versus now as individuals you have a higher capacity, or smaller groups of people you have higher capacity to experiment. So how do you look at failure and knowing when to stop with your experiment?
Frankly speaking, I mean, if you think about the experiment being eradicating in the educational inequality, sorry, I'm coming back to this all the time, this should not fail. This is something that should definitely not fail, and I think you know, maybe we can shift this debate slightly, because I don't want to talk about this, monopolize this topic all the time. But the role of the government so we've been talking about where's this money coming from, what's the role of the government? You know, I'm not entirely saying that the government should be doing all of this, you know, like help building the institution, help building the framework, where also private companies would be able to eradicate this. So I'm not saying that this has all this learning has to be done in a university, in a public university, for example. I mean, financing this that's definitely an important role. But the examples of Volkswagen and Google have shown that companies are sometimes, I would say, even much more effectively, the more effective players or stakeholders in reskilling, because they are at the technological frontier. They know what the workers do. They also have an institution. I think about this Volkswagen example a lot, because try to bring people that are 60 years old towards the last 5 years or last decade of their educational, of their vocational career, of their career, into a room with 20 years old talking about digital technologies. Many of them would shy away. They say like, oh, this is going to be so embarrassing. Not the case for Volkswagen. Why? Because they had a very strong overarching identity. They were all on the same assembly line somehow. They were all under the same roof. And this is something that these institutions can provide, and this is something that private institutions can provide as well. Yeah.
And I think my only addition to it is to say something can be both gradual and fast, which is to say we have intuitions about how dangerous some of these things are, and we should meter their introduction accordingly. And if I think about something that's worked recently, one example that's worked is the introduction of self-driving cars in San Francisco. For any of you who have been there, Waymo now operates point-to-point for a lot of San Francisco. It happened so gradually that there wasn't one day where you thought, oh my goodness, there it is. And in that case, why was that? Well, we knew cars are dangerous, so good, we slowed it. One of the challenges with some generative AI models is that there's debate over how dangerous they are, so that's a debate we need to have. And then the second is that there was a public asset that gave the government a hook into the piece of the introduction of the technology. In that case, the public asset is the streets. Government controls the streets, and so it can say how rapidly you can introduce something. And we need to find other hooks for institutions like organized labor, government, culture, et cetera, to be able to comment on the introduction of other forms of AI as they enter our world.
No, thank you. That was super helpful. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. And I think it's time for lunch now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.